Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, today we are going to talk on women and reforms, and for this very discussion we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Webb. Dr. Shruti Webb is Assistant Professor in PGDAV College, that is the evening college. Welcome our guest Dr. Shruti Webb, and let's try to understand the topic in detail on women and reforms. Hello ma'am, welcome to the DSET lecture.
Hello Geetika. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak on the subject. In today's lecture, I have divided the lecture into three parts. Part 1 deals with the issue of colonialism, modernity and reformism. Then part 2 deals with the ambiguities that were there as part of the reforms, which have not really been talked about. And part 3 deals with implications of reforms for women. Now coming to part 1, that is colonialism and reformism. Here my emphasis has been on talking about how the colonial regime, the Britishers who were ruling India from 1757 onwards, how they projected Indian society. So at the very onset, let me make it clear that the aim of Britishers was to expose Indian society as being extremely degraded. And most British colonial and missionary writings viewed the position of women in India before their advent as one marked by a great hardship and full of evils. The condition of women in India became one of the principal means for the empire to justify its civilizing mission. So this civilizing mission was always at back of the mind of the colonial masters whenever they talked about the depraved Indian society or the deplorable condition of women in India. So we have personalities like James Mill who argued that the status of women indicated the society's rung on the ladder of civilization, and as far as this was concerned, Indians, they really fared badly, because according to James Mill, the position of women in Indian society was deplorable. So therefore, the moral standards were also deplorable, and a lot needed to be done to change the situation. Now, this entire debate hinged on the factor of modernity. So coming to the idea of modernity, the issue of modernity, the idea of modernity grew and spread through the process of colonization, colonialism, and it became integral to the nation-state building system that emerged in due course of time during 19th and 20th centuries. And this incorporated various countries of Asia, Africa, etc. It unfolds a narrative of progress, a break from an irrational tradition and a derived meaning in which we always overcome and surpass that which came before. So an implicit understanding was that in order to become modern, it was important to break from the past. So whatever was existing or pre-existing had to be undone, and whatever new was improvised or introduced, it represented modern. Then thirdly, modernity is put into effect through a number of new initiatives like science and technology, the development of new social institutions like hospitals, schools, colleges, universities, factories, etc. and a whole new way of mobilizing people. So basically, the idea that was conveyed was that if these new institutions were introduced in a society, and particularly in a colonial society like India, then modernity was bound to arrive. Then, though modernity arose in the West, and soon it was replicated in other parts of the world, and colonization played a very important role in this process. According to Roffel, modernity is a story people tell themselves about themselves in relation to others. So basically, the entire narrative is not rooted in the social tradition, but it comes from outside, and then it is enforced and it is gladly accepted by those who adopt this process or are forced to adopt this process. Then modernity also arises autonomously within the nation state, a theme that would be discussed in due course of the lecture. Then modernity leads to the same practices and effects, everyone finds it. So the entire focus is on universalization, the entire focus is on creating homogeneity. So the differences are deliberately overlooked and are not really welcome in this entire process of project of modernity. Now, a very important role was played in this the whole issue of social reform movement, and in this whole issue of pointing out differences between a Western society and an Eastern society by British feminists. So these British feminists of 19th and 20th centuries, their agenda was definitely to give a helping hand to the colonial regime, and they were imbued with an imperialist consciousness of racial hierarchy. They basically emphasized on three aspects in course of their discussion and in course of their deliberations. One was that the superiority of white women as being morally pure and nurturing and far more superior than any other race on earth. Then secondly, it was the issue of race preservation. So women as mothers of the race, because women were bearing children, so their grooming was very important so that the human race appeared more civilized, more cultured and more docile. And thirdly, women as vessels of society, that is, those who would procreate responsible imperial citizens and not as those who would procreate rebels. And the very existence of the feminist movement depended on the racialized construct of the colonized other. So this racial implication was very important, and it needs to be understood in the right perspective when one talks about British feminists and their impact on the socio-religious reform movements that were taking off during 19th century, the first half of 19th century itself. Now, the way Indian women were being projected was in a very, I would say, deplorable kind of a stand that was taken, and a white woman was taking upon herself a burden so as to civilize the women of the Orient, the Indian women. So women as such were not seen as equals, but in need of saving. That is, the larger belief was that Indian women were weak, they needed help, they were asking for help, and it was on the part of these white women feminists belonging to Britain and other European countries, and they had a moral duty to come and save Indian women from their deplorable condition. Now, in this entire narrative, what was ignored was that there were some indigenous feminist movements rooted in Indian tradition which were also making their voice felt, but these were deliberately ignored. Then modern Western feminism was largely influenced by the imperial assumptions of the mother country. So, the benefit of the mother country was definitely to be addressed, and it was in that background all the issues that were raised from time to time, and colony was declared as the site of reform. So, these reforms were definitely sought after and looked up to, because this would result in creation of a strong colonial society which would definitely pave the way for a stronger political and economic nexus that would emerge between the Indians and the colonial masters. A very important role in this entire narrative was played by some women social reformers and educationists of Britain, like Mary Carpenter, who was born in 1807, lived till 1877. She was an educational and a social reformer. She visited India in 1860s and promoted female education and reforms. Now, an account of Mary Carpenter's 6 months in India is a very important piece of narrative because it discusses in detail the deplorable position of Indian women and their position in society. Now, this narrative became a bestseller in those times. It became very popular not only in India but also in European countries. The emphasis of this narrative was more on criticism of Indian society rather than on improving the conditions of women. So whatever was being discussed was to throw light on various evil practices that existed and the bad state in which women lived their lives, without even referring to what needed to be done actually and what practical measures needed to be taken. And British feminists, in their course of discussion, robbed Indian women of their power. That is, they refused to accept the agency that already existed, women's agency that had already started taking shape during 19th century, and how educated women after 1850s, 1860s were writing their own autobiographies. They were questioning the given social norms, and they were inspiring other women, not only of their households but of larger society, to fall in line and to take to education and to start thinking about themselves. So all these initiatives were happily overlooked, and the only emphasis was on criticizing what was and not suggesting what and how it could be done. Now, in this entire description of Indian society, what seems amusing is that these British feminists, they deliberately overlooked what was wrong with European society and how European society viewed its women. So, here I would like to talk about briefly the various facets of gender discrimination that very well existed in European society of 19th century. So, married European women had hardly any legal rights. They were not allowed to vote. Then they had to submit to laws, and when they had no voice in their formation. So, women's voice in lawmaking was absolutely absent, and married women had no property rights even in European society during 19th century. Then husbands had legal power over and responsibility for their wives to the extent that they could imprison or even beat them without any legal action being taken against them. Then divorce and child custody laws also hugely favored men, giving hardly any rights to women. Then women had to pay property tax, though they had no representation in the levying of these taxes. Most occupations were closed to women, and when women did work, they were grossly underpaid. Women were not allowed to enter various professions like medicine or law, and women had no means to gain an education since no college or university accepted women students. With only a few exceptions, women were not allowed to participate in the affairs of the church, and largely speaking, women were totally made dependent on men, willingly or unwillingly. So, this entire narrative of how European society was progressing as far as gender equality was concerned was deliberately overlooked by both the colonial administrators as well as British feminists, who were making such huge and cry about various evils that were prevalent in Indian society. Now, the entire agenda was focused on maintaining an empire, how an empire could be maintained and all the bottlenecks could be removed. So, Western women feminists played a very important role in creating, sustaining and maintaining British Empire through its disguised feminist project, or what you can call a white woman's burden, to save the enslaved Indian women. A very interesting reading as far as this aspect is concerned is that can be referred to is by Inderpal Grewal, who has written The Culture of Travel and the Gendering of Colonial Modernity in 19th Century India. Now, in this account, Inderpal Grewal has made a point, that is, the colonial modernity should be seen as a gendered issue. The production of gendered selves resulted in a reconstitution of domestic space under colonialism, that is, the already existing categories of caste, class, familial and gender demarcations were reworked at times, but most of the times they were replicated. And Indian men, while in their drive to gain equality with the British, they discovered new modes of patriarchal power which were very well practiced by them both in the public and the private sphere. And in this entire process, the emphasis was more on glorification of Indian past. So, another kind of anomaly that was taking shape was to project ancient India as a period of great achievements, equality for women, where women were not being exploited and they were not being deprived of various things that men were doing. So again, there was a wrong way of studying history, projecting history, wrong facts that were being narrated, and the entire process again resulted in procreation of patriarchy and strengthening of patriarchal linkages. Now, this entire process of reform movements, it took off during the first half of 19th century, when colonialism had definitely made its mark over most of India. And in this entire process, it would be interesting to see that state conservatism was playing a very important role in negating the effects of women movement or demands for equality of women. So while we think that colonialism was a more modernizing force, or it should have been a more liberating force on Indian society, it was not always so. So while the lip service was definitely for the reforms and for bringing about change in the society, the prime mover was the colonial interest itself. So the colonial states now this point can be proved by giving you some examples of some cases and what was the stand that was taken up by the colonial state in such cases. For example, we have a case in 1872 of a girl, Huchi. She was a young Hindu girl who converted to Christianity, and she refused cohabitation with her Hindu husband. So the issue was taken up by the courts, and the court as well as the missionaries, they both took a stand that Huchi should go and start a married life. She has no choice. She has to cohabit with her husband, and the husband was given all the rights over her. So here we have a perfect example of how the missionaries and the courts, they were not really adopting a more modern or a more liberal stand by taking into consideration what a girl wanted, and rather she was forced into a marriage which she never wanted to enter into. Then another example of how patriarchal interests were being furthered during 19th century colonial India and even during 20th century colonial India in the garb of colonial laws. Here we can give an example of Malabar Nair men who began to oppose the traditional matrilineal residence and inheritance patterns. Now, the Nair society was a matrilineal society where it was the woman of the household who was the head of the family. Now, once Nair men got educated, they started doing jobs, they started earning. Now, they wanted to pass on their wealth to their children, and they wanted that their name should be carried on in the family name, and hence they demanded a change in the centuries old matrilineal system, which was the very feature of Nair society. As a result of this, the Malabar Marriage Act was passed in 1896, which made some changes, and a debate started on the whole issue of matrilineality. And in 1933, a new law was passed which allowed Nair men to bequeath their own incomes to their offspring and allowed them to set up conjugal households. So now Nair women were not going to stay in their parental houses, they were going to shift to their husband's house and start a normal married life so as to carry forward the legacy of an educated, modern, dominant caste Nair community, masculinity, which emerged and which greatly questioned and weakened Nair women's claims to landholding privileges. So these two examples go a long way in proving that colonialism was not always about bringing about positive change or deliverance from immoral practices that were prevalent in society, and colonialism did not go beyond a point. It acted, but then with various breaks and checks. The nationalist historians have repeatedly talked about the colonial state as mainly interested in cultural colonization of Indians to make a class of anglicized Indian supporters. But here too, some contrary facts emerged. That is, from 1820s to 1850s, one does not really come across such a change being initiated by the colonial state, because the colonial state was willingly accepting a liberal Brahmanical interpretation of religious scriptures. Rather, the entire narrative of sati and widow remarriage was based on such Brahmanical scriptures, that because Brahmanical scriptures do not allow sati, so this practice needs to be stopped, and there is no reason why it should continue. So, according to this, what emerges is that colonialism was also rooted in traditionalism, in scriptures, and the whole idea of modernity was flawed, and one needs to question the very genesis of modernity and various reform movements that had been initiated with the idea of modernity in the minds of colonialists. By the end of the 19th century, women agency came on its own, and various associations of Indian women started carrying forward the initiative for reform. Now, this was not only in the realm of various evil practices like sati, etc., but also in the realm of education, in the realm of health, and in the realm of franchise, about which we would be talking in due course of time. Now, a very important aspect that needs to be discussed is reformism and gender. The socio-religious reform movements of the 19th century and their contradictory relationship with the gender question, as well as the premises of liberal reformism. Now, the whole idea of liberal reformism was rooted in the idea of religious and social reforms in the 19th and 20th centuries that were proposed within an environment where strict female seclusion, illiteracy, celibate widowhood were mandatory. So, Indian society during 18th, 19th century was definitely more, it was not gender neutral. It was heavily weighed against women, and a very strict life code was had been pre-decided and had been followed for centuries by women. So the very idea of questioning that those given things in the society was going to be a Herculean task, not only for the reformers who had to adopt various liberal strategies, but also for women to come out of their shells and to start questioning what had been a norm till now. And this entire debate was operating within the background of Hindu orthodoxy. So, child marriage was both a scriptural and a social necessity due to the detrimental effects of educating girls. So, everything was linked. The evil practices were there because of certain set mindsets, and in order to question these evil practices, it was very important first to question the mindsets and to bring about a change in the mindsets, which again was not a very easy task. Reformism also had to operate within the limits that had been fixed by orthodoxy. So these limits were very difficult to transcend, and even reformers like Ram Mohan Roy, in his endeavor to stop sati, guaranteed that widows would follow the path of austerity, chastity, and need not be sacrificed as sati. So therefore, even a liberal modern reformer like Ram Mohan Roy had to take recourse to, ultimately he had to take recourse to scriptures, to Vedas, and he had to talk about how ancient Indian scriptures did not really allow these various evil practices to continue. And the ideal of purity was very well ingrained in this entire debate, that there was no need for women to perform sati, because in any case women were pure and they would be following the path of purity, come whatever may. So this justification had to be given even by reformers like Ram Mohan Roy, that at no point of time chastity or purity would be compromised. And when widowhood started being questioned, and when there was an increasing discussion about widow remarriage after 1850s, then also the logic was that the scriptures allowed that. So the entire idea had to be rooted, the genesis of the idea had to be rooted in ancient scriptures, come what may, even if those very scriptures had robbed women of their powers till now. Having discussed all these various aspects, now I would be briefly taking a break, and then we would be talking about the second part of the lecture, that is the historiography, the various interpretations that we would be discussing in due course of time. Thank you. this session, we would be discussing the historiography of the reform movements that took place in India during 19th, 20th centuries. Well, I would be beginning with the reformist rhetoric. The traditional history writing has projected socio-religious reform movements from a very simplistic kind of an understanding, from the point of view of narrating the events as belonging to one grand narrative. And most nationalist writings have analyzed the Hindu socio-religious reform movements as a simplistic phenomenon that needed celebration, that was a great achievement in itself. They claimed that they led to the emancipation of women, that is, these religious reform socio-religious reform movements resulted in great changes in the lives of women, and they brought them from darkness to enlightenment and resulted in socio and cultural progress, and they also kind of saved them from the stagnation, the life of stagnation that they were leading, to one of fulfillment, to one of rights. And particularly in this entire description, medieval India was projected as one representing the Dark Age, when women were devoid of their rights and they were forced to adopt parda, they were forced to practice sati due to the evil influences of invaders. Now, in this entire narrative, the historians belonging to this particular group, they claimed that the reforms were a result of indigenous efforts. Indigenous meaning the efforts of Indian reformers. So they kind of questioned the idea that it was the colonial regime or the British reformers, the British officials who instigated these changes in Indian society. So they projected that what ended, in fact, in due course of discussion, was the obscene representation of women in literature and art. And this, according to them, was truly morally binding and brought about a change in the way Indian women were to be represented henceforth. To glorify the enlightenment and the liberating effect of Hindu reforms on and for women, it became imperative, it became very important to project the earlier period, particularly the medieval period, the Mughal India, as one marked by many regressive features, as one marked by invasion, disruption, and forcible conversion. And in this entire scheme of things, the ancient India was projected as the golden age, where women were valued and enjoyed a much higher status as compared to the medieval India, and also as compared to the contemporary standards, that is 19th century Indian society. The discourse on parda amongst the Hindu reformers highlighted it as an evil problem, which was again a byproduct of Muslim rule and came into force largely due to two reasons. One, according to them, was the Muslim custom of parda that was gradually adopted by Indian women also, Hindu women also, and the other was the need to use parda as a tool, as a medium to protect Hindu women from the gaze of the outsiders. And so the entire onus of the evil practice of parda was conveniently laid on the medieval rulers, medieval Indian history, and both the ancient India as well as the 19th century India had no role in this entire process of keeping women confined in parda. And the social reforms were depicted as enlightening after a long period of darkness. So the entire Indian history was conveniently being relooked at and was conveniently being wrongly portrayed in a way so as to justify the high moral ground of Hindu social reformers. Now, coming to the next aspect of historiography, that is how to start questioning this kind of a given historical framework. So later historians gave an alternative explanation, and they pointed out to various lacunae, various shortcomings that existed in the socio-religious reform movements. So rather than accepting these reform movements as a grand narrative, as a meta narrative that had to be respected, that had to be talked about, that had to be valorized, what these historians offered was questioning. What these historians offered was doubting and proving that how there were various gaps in the theories of reformers, and how it was not as if these reform movements were universally and unilaterally modern in their outlook, or they brought about a positive change for all categories of Indian women. So all the earlier initiatives on the women's question were taken largely by men. This was one anomaly that was pointed out by these new historians like Sumit Sarkar, Charles Hemseth, Jones. So these historians writing in 1960s, 80s and 2000, they pointed out that how these reform movements, though they largely talked about women and changing lives of women, but they were universally, the issues were being taken up by men, and women were completely absent in this entire narrative of questioning the evil practices. So definitely there must have been some women who were doubtful about these reforms, but their voice was never clearly projected or made part of the narrative. Then the reformers, these historians pointed out that the reformers belonged mostly to upper classes, and they represented largely the views and ideas of the elite class, and mainly addressed problems of upper caste, middle class Hindu women. So here again, this was a limiting factor which hardly nationalist historians talked about, that how these socio-religious reform movements did not really take into account hardships faced by common women, hardships faced by low caste, low class women, and some pertinent issues that needed to be raised remained unraised. The reformers were primarily concerned with modifying relationships within the families, and even this modified relationships did not really result in complete independence for women. Rather, it resulted in a controlled emancipation. A very limited and a controlled emancipation was the result, and in some cases even that was not the result, and everything remained at the level of rhetoric. Partha Chatterjee made a very interesting recommendation in 1993, and he pointed out that how with the growth of the national movement, the women's question was combined with the larger political project and put on hold pending the achievement of national objectives. Now, what do you mean by the phrase women's question? Women's question means the various hardships that women were facing in Indian society during 19th century or 20th century, various deprivations, various evil practices that were still continuing, and a movement had already started in order to bring about a change in all this. But as pointed out by Partha Chatterjee, the national movement, as it took off in a big way during 20th century, especially with the coming of Mahatma Gandhi, deliberately put a check on this women's question, because everything had to be put on hold till India got freedom, till colonialism was eradicated, and the women's question could conveniently be taken up at a later date and could conveniently be discussed later on with or without women once independence was won. Now, the next school of thought that we would be discussing as part of historiography is the subaltern historians. How subalterns have viewed the reform movements. First, let us discuss what is the meaning of the term subaltern. Originally, the term subaltern referred to subordinates in military hierarchies. That is, those who were at the lower levels of hierarchy were in the military were known as subalterns. And it was Antonio Gramsci in his prison diaries. The prison diaries refers to writings about hegemony that were penned by Antonio Gramsci when he was imprisoned. Now, he tactfully used the term subaltern so as to pass the prison censors. So, if he would not have used the term, then probably his writings would have been censored, and he used it to signify a non-unified proletarian. Proletarian means the working class, those whose voices could not be heard due to being structurally molded out of the capitalist bourgeois narrative. So, basically subaltern refers to those categories whose voice has not been given a chance to be heard, they have not been given a chance to talk, and this largely refers to the lower sections of Indian society, the marginalized sections. You can include in this a whole range of marginalized groups like scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, women, Muslims, sections of Muslims, and various other groups whose voices are still remaining to be sufficiently heard. The subaltern studies group later picked up the term from Gramsci in order to locate and re-establish a voice or collective agency in post-colonial India for those denied access to representation by the colonial state. So, the group of subaltern historians have talked about these various hitherto neglected communities, groups, categories who were not sufficiently represented by the colonial administration. A most important writer of this genre is Gayatri Spivak, one of the group's members, who wrote a well-known and debated article, "Can the Subaltern Speak?" In it, she argues that attempts to give collective voice to a subaltern group inevitably run into the problem of creating dependence upon intellectuals to speak for the subaltern condition instead of allowing them to speak for themselves. So, here again she has pointed out that how in this entire endeavor of rediscovering subaltern voices, again an anomaly exists that all those who are writing on behalf of them are not subaltern. They have not themselves lived those lives of subjugation, and therefore a very valid question is, can the subalterns speak for themselves? So, it is due to this dilemma that the subaltern historians have taken recourse to a new kind of history writing where they are not really depending too much on archival material. Rather, the focus is on recovering whatever was recorded or lays unrecorded so far in the form of various autobiographies, biographies, songs, dialects, folk songs, stories, etc., and how through these various unconventional sources, a new kind of history writing which will give more space to the voice of subalterns is taken recourse to. Now, subaltern historians have attempted to search for a non-elite perspective for understanding historical processes. And it is in this endeavor that they have questioned the coercive power of modernity, that how modernity was not something that was easily adopted, but people were forced to adopt. And in this forcible process, the very idea behind it was given away, or it got diluted. Then subaltern historians have increasingly pointed to the coercive way of reformers. They argue that the central question regarding women in the 19th century was not what women wanted, but rather how to modernize them. So subaltern historians have very interestingly pointed out that most of the socio-religious reform movements that increasingly talked about abolition of sati, widow remarriage, and passing of Age of Consent Act, etc. All these reforms definitely went a long way in bringing about a positive change in the lives of women. But what was the underlying idea behind these reforms? What was the underlying idea behind introducing education for women during 19th century? The idea was not to bring about a positive change in the lives of women, but to make women more appealing for men, to make them look more outwardly educated, upwardly mobile, to be able to stand and walk with their husbands, to be able to take care of their families in a better way. And in this entire process, what got diluted was what these women wanted for themselves, and whether these reforms that were introducing so many changes took into consideration those wishes or not. Then subaltern historians have also pointed out that how there was an increasing conformity and marginalization of women's space and culture due to Renaissance, Enlightenment and modernity. And this was a trend that was not only seen in India, it had already happened in Europe in the course of Enlightenment and in the course of Renaissance, and the same thing got replicated during 19th century in India also, that we would be discussing in due course of time. Now the next genre of historians that I would be talking about is the feminist historians, feminist scholars, and how they have perceived socio-religious reform movements. An alternative account of colonial social reforms from a gender sensitive perspective was developed by historians like Tanika Sarkar in 2001. Then much earlier it had been done by Kumkum Sangari and Nair. Now these historians, they pointed out that how the reforms indicate little about women's desires, emotions, health and work, and they produce a more complex and textured view of processes of social reform, which is definitely need of the hour. The debates over social issues constructed women as victims or as heroines, denying them complex personalities and agencies. So everything was to be projected in black and white. There were no shades of grey in between, and the active agency of women was again overlooked according to these feminist historians. Women became the site on which tradition was debated and reformulated, with the exclusion of the voices of women themselves, a point that had been made by Lata Mani in 1998. So everything was about women, but nothing was by women. So this was a very interesting, description of the socio-religious reform movements that has been attempted by these feminist historians. And as a result, as has been pointed out by Nair, no significant changes came about in the existing nexus of gender relations, because the very genesis of reform movements was coming from only one gender, that was men. So definitely it was very difficult or rather impossible to question the gender implications of Indian society. Then there is also an attempt to project the confusion regarding rhetoric and reality as far as socio-religious reform movements are concerned. The rhetoric of Hindu social reform reworked and updated patriarchy in a different form and combined it with an assertion of a homogeneous Hindu ritual and political identity. Thereby, it became very important to control Hindu women. This means that what was projected as a necessity for reform was the idea that the entire Indian society and all the women living in Indian society belonged to upper caste. They all belonged to upper caste and they were all Hindus, whereas this was not the case. So, the socio-religious reform movements in due course of their fluorescence refused to take into account a number of differences and deviations that existed and that needed to be taken into account. The liberal basis of the reformist discourse was considerably overturned when within it the women came to be viewed as a means to rework and recover an imagined glorious Hindu past, and her place at home was again valorized as the space of uncontaminated purity. So again, the reality continued to be the same, that is, women as upkeeper of the domestic space, pure epitome of whatever was the best, whereas at the level of rhetoric, one could talk about modernity, one could talk about changing social values, but again that remained at the level of rhetoric. Now we come to the third part of our lecture, and that is the ambiguous implications of reforms for women. What do you mean by ambiguous? Ambiguous means that you are trying to do something but something else happens, or you say something and that is not being, that the hidden agenda says something else. So most of the reforms that we are going to discuss, they had ambiguities. So everything was not clear cut, everything was not what it was projected to be, and things could not be achieved in a straightforward manner. So various twists and turns were there that need to be talked about. Gender stereotypes continued to be invoked in various debates around women and reform that we would be discussing shortly, and many of the reforms expressly directed towards improving women's lot often benefited men more than women, and the agenda of a more modern society, which was going to again benefit the colonial state, which was again going to benefit the British Raj, was never really given up. Now the first reform that we would be talking about is Parda. So the whole idea behind Parda, the questioning the practice, the evil practice of Parda, was rooted in contentious customs. There was an insistence on modesty as the Hindu woman's best possession. So at the very onset of the debate regarding Parda, that why women should adopt this practice, it was at the very onset made clear that Indian women's natural ornament was modesty, and that was in itself sufficient. There was no need for Parda to cover them up from top to toe. Charu Gupta, the historian, remarked in 2001 that how there was a simultaneous condemnation and an endorsement for Parda. So while women were being advised to give up the practice, but at the same time it was an expectation that at railway stations, roads and public ghats, women are not going to expose themselves. So whatever liberty women had of bathing at public ghats was now increasingly being attacked, and Charu Gupta has described this entire narrative, that how we have so many tracts for 19th and 20th century where this practice of women bathing at ghats openly was being attacked, and the whole the notion of creating this public private dichotomy was again carried forward in due course of time. Then reformers were greatly critical of women exposing themselves and singing sexually explicit songs while keeping a veil at home. So again there was this ambiguity that on the one hand women are keeping a veil at home, on the other hand they are exposing themselves openly in public and not really maintaining decorum. So in the course of debates on Parda, all these issues increasingly relegated women to the private sphere rather than opening public sphere for them. Now, there are a number of reforms that were taken up, and I would be discussing about these reforms in the next lecture, and in that discussion we would be greatly talking about various debates, we would be discussing various ambiguities that became part of the entire narrative. As for today, the lecture comes to an end. Thank you.
With this note, thank you ma'am, thank you so very much for giving us a vivacious session on women and reform. And dear friends, we would like to write to us at info.cc@nic.in. Your questions, your feedbacks are welcome over here. This lecture is going to be uploaded on YouTube, and afterwards if you feel so that you want to write something or ask something, definitely you can write. Dear friends, we will be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you ma'am, thank you once again.
Thank you, Gita.